When you discuss, more likely argue, about something on social media, what is your purpose? Are you arguing to change hearts and minds? Are you arguing as an academic exercise? If you're honest with yourself, you probably aren't. Are you arguing to win the argument? Again, if you're honest with yourself, you probably are doing that. Or you might be arguing to silence a dissenting opinion. The fact people look for a winner or loser in these threads is the problem. Discussion of important topics like the prevalence of tribalism in politics and the detrimental effect it is having on our society as a whole, or the discussion of dismantling of political norms and the need to reinstate or create norms and institutions should be just that, discussion. Instead, it is framed as a debate, where both sides attempt to score points and ultimately are attempting to win rather than have a discussion and learn from one another's point of view, with the intention of trying to understand one another. It's amateur competitive debate, basically, and it is bad for our society, bad for our ability to communicate with one another in an effective manner on the very issues we need to communicate with one another on the most. The social media wars, meme wars, the news wars, all from those last 5 years or more, have escalated the decline in civility in the United States and across the world where internet access and social media are readily accessible and used. It is not the fault of any single group or person, but rather a slow decline that began at minimum 30 years ago. This is a recognizable pattern in history, even without there being an internet or social media. Although, social media definitely plays a major role in the rapidity with which we isolate into our tribal echo chambers now. There are multiple examples from history where a decline in civility and an inability to have civil discourse on topics within a society has led to some catastrophic events. History in context, and pivotal topics in particular, is geared towards providing the historical backdrop to modern events without trying to place blame or demonize. It is, in essence, my attempt at civil discourse. Civility is defined as civilized conduct, especially courteous and politeness. Civil discourse is engagement in discourse or conversation intended to enhance understanding. It is also generally defined as being civil in tone, meaning respectful discourse, free from things like name-calling, ad hominem attacks, trolling like sea lioning, rhetoric, or committing other logical fallacies in purposeful attempts to win the debate. It isn't a debate. Not in terms of there being points and a score kept and a winner or loser crowned. It's not academic, nor competitive in nature. It is not an attempt to stifle a dissenting opinion through disingenuous actions and comments. Civil discourse is supposed to enhance understanding of two viewpoints in order to foster a better chance for compromise between two groups. By discussing things freely, openly, and in a civil manner, sides are able to better understand one another, make decisions that can benefit all the stakeholders in a society. Just how much of this do you see today? If you're an American like I am, you might not see much of it at all. Where does that come from, though? How long has it been this way? Well, if you look back at the various election campaigns, particularly presidential campaigns, and the subsequent presidents and Congresses during those time periods, we start to see a dramatic uptick in incivility in the parties and government several times in U.S. history. Each time preceded a time period of marked upheaval. The Jacksonian era, particularly with the elections of 1824 and 1828, the run-up to the American Civil War with the election of 1860, obviously, then again in the 1930s, and most recently there's a distinct climb upward in combativeness and incivility in politics beginning in the 1980s. Okay, so what does a dramatic decrease in civility and civil discourse in a society really mean? What does it matter? Well, besides the obvious examples from American history, there are multiple examples from other parts of history. They also share significant correlations with the current pattern of events in the United States since the early 1980s and 90s. The two examples I want to focus on are Rome, particularly the beginning of the end of the Republican era, and France during the French Revolution. The correlation between those events and the current political social climate in the United States are too close to be ignored. Historians and sociologists love to draw correlations between the United States and ancient Rome. In many respects, they are quite similar, due in large part to their shared heritage of representative government and emphasis on a strong standing military and emphasis on political norms to corral bad behavior. While many of the observed similarities are indeed important, others, particularly from the imperial period, aren't as relevant. The period most interesting to me from an American perspective is the period just prior to the rise of Julius Caesar. In his book, The Storm Before the Storm, Mike Duncan, who also creates the excellent podcast Revolutions, goes into great detail recounting the problems that began to develop in the Roman Republic that eventually led to its demise and the subsequent rise of the imperial period. In his book, Mike Duncan does a great job of explaining how the problems faced by the Roman Republic mirror many of the problems we face today in the United States. Income inequality, endemic partisanship, and xenophobia ran rampant through Rome near the end of the Republic. All three of those run rampant today in the United States. Those three factors were also largely at play during the French Revolution. Drastic income inequality, particularly the tax codes in France, partisanship that was practically written into law, and constant fear of foreign governments influencing the French elections and processes. That certainly must sound familiar to those of you listening to this in the United States today. But what's the point of bringing this up or drawing these correlations? History in Context has two podcasts. One is strictly teaching lessons like I teach in my classes and drawing modern contextual conclusions and making inferences about the past and present in a short format. That's called A Brief History of the World. The second, Pivotal Topics, is centered around discussing today in the context of the past. The cliche about those who fail to learn from history are bound to repeat it comes to mind often when I sit down to write episodes, outlines, and copy. If we can see the patterns and the mistakes of the past, we may be able to make less drastic mistakes, new mistakes even, that have outcomes less tragic and bloody. What's an example of this then? First, some historical context about the root problem, tribalism. Before we get anywhere near the topics of the centuries-long decline of the Roman Republic and the tossing aside of mos maiorum, or political norms, and the rampant violence that ensued in an age of staunch partisan discord, or the discussion of the French food shortages and destruction of their governmental norms and systems, resulting in a reign of terror and thousands being led to the guillotine, there's an idea that helps explain all those things coming about. It's the root of the tree of discord, tribalism. I wrote a research paper once on tribalism in modern society, and I'm going to discuss much of that here as it sets up why we are the way we are politically and socially, and helps frame the discussion for how we go to the extremes we get to. Humans and their societies have always been organized in some way, and this organization is one of the keys to our success throughout history. The human race, or Homo sapiens, has been around for over 100,000 years, with modern agrarian societies being about 10,000 to 12,000 years old. In that time, humans have always organized themselves into groups, the first of which was the hunter-gatherer bands, which developed slowly into clans or tribes. The development of tribes led to the development of the tribal mindset in humans, which is closely related to the familial bonds that we have instinctually. Tribalism is defined as the state or fact of being organized in a tribe or tribes, and the behavior and attitudes that stem from strong loyalty to one's own tribe or social group. That definition summary is from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. According to Jared Diamond, a noted American anthropologist, tribalism is, in many ways, a tool for the self-preservation of a group. That's the type of tribalism on display every day on Twitter and Facebook. Can you imagine a conversation about politics on those sites where the sides weren't arguing from a place of self-preservation? What would that conversation even look like? This attitude of group preservation and tribalism persisted in human societies even as societies developed into more complex structures. The development of the city-state and later the nation-states out of the Neolithic communities of prehistory shaped and molded our tribalism into a tool they used for self-preservation, but also as a tool for control and manipulation. Although tribalism or identity politics on a wide scale was once a safety mechanism for humans, it has become a detriment to progress, and its inclusion in modern societies remains problematic. Pre-agricultural societies are commonly referred to as hunter-gatherer societies. Another term for that is a forager society. These foragers are our direct ancestors, and for the majority of the time humans have been on Earth, we were foragers, not what we are today, which is the product of agricultural revolution. Our human nature or instincts are influenced much more by our forager ancestors than by those of the more recent agriculturalists. According to historian Chris Harman, our species is over 100,000 years old. For 95% of this time, it has not been characterized at all by many of the forms of behavior ascribed to human nature today. Clearly, humans were shaped more by the 95% of their history they spent developing under forager societies than by the 5% we spent as agriculturalists. Most importantly, people spent 95% of their time developing societies that were tribal in nature, meaning based upon small-scale kin relationships. In these types of societies, the security of the group was dependent upon cooperation and sharing within the group, but not necessarily with outsiders. Again, according to Harman, at every point, the premium was on cooperation and collective values. Without them, no band of foragers could have survived more than a few days. Through cooperation, humans create a sense of belonging, pride, and achievement through their collective successes. Nowhere in our history was success through collective accomplishment more important than in the forager societies of our prehistoric past. It is unsurprising then that this emphasis on tightly knit cooperation and collective values based upon a kin or tribal grouping would eventually be passed down into the next phases of human development, as they represent an essential tool used by these first groups of humans to survive. Cooperation and shared values in a group were more than a tool for survival through foraging. This cooperation, coupled with familial ties as a kin group, helped foster a sense of belonging to the group. This kinship became more important as humans began to evolve into agriculturalists. Individual households were often integrated into larger social groupings. Each was expected to share food with the other so that no household would suffer because of the failure of a crop or because it had more young children to bring up than others. The importance of the community as a whole, based on these loose lineages in supporting each other for the success of the whole of society, was a bedrock of the early agriculturalists. By ensuring that each family was successful in their own way, either through food production or child rearing, etc., the tribal attitude became an important factor throughout all the early agriculturalist societies. The more complex a society became, and the more it interacted with other tribes, the identity of that tribe along kin-clan lines became an important tool of self-defense. During times of hardship, this tribalism could often become what we would call xenophobic. In his article for Foreign Affairs in their 2018 May-June volume, Ronald Inglehart states, quote, "When food supplies rose, population levels rose with them. When food grew scarce, population shrank. In both lean and fat times, most people lived just about the starvation level. During extreme scarcity, xenophobia was a realistic strategy. When a tribe's territory produced just enough to sustain it, another tribe moving in could spell death for the original inhabitants." End quote. Inglehart is explaining a common human characteristic referred to in the Old West of the U.S. as circling the wagons. When times are hard and when outsiders are encroaching, you look to the defense of your group, your tribe. This tribal defense mechanism, which began with our foraging forebears and translated over to the first agriculturalists, would continue to be used as a tool as societies became more complex. The more urgent and frequent the threats to the tribe became, the more the tribes would turn to a single leader to see them through. The development of the chieftain, or sole patriarchal leader, coincides closely with the development of the state. At first, the city-state. As human society progressively became larger and more complex, the need for strict laws and strong leadership grew. But while human society grew and changed, it also kept some of its core, or root beliefs and structures. One of these was most definitely tribalism, which would develop into identity politics over time. It is easy to see how the city-states of Mesopotamia grew from a strong sense of tribal-based unity. Each city-state in Mesopotamia consisted of a people who allegedly shared a common ancestry and culture. Nancy Stockdale writes in her article Mesopotamia, quote, "Within 300 years, they established all of the tools for building the first major collection of cities, tied together by a single culture and economy, surplus agriculture, extensive trade in manufactured goods, and a consolidated religious belief system based on animist beliefs that illustrated the dramatic natural world around them. The Sumerian city-states struggled for political power among themselves." End quote. While many of the city-states shared common cultural beliefs, traditions, and even their writing, they did not share a common identity. Much like the disparate Greek city-states several centuries later, while they shared these similarities, even the language, they remained separate. They remained beholden to the idea those from the other city-states were in fact other, or they were outsiders. The roots of xenophobia lie far back in our past as foraging bands, and that xenophobia toward the outsider was passed down to our more advanced forebears, even as they created societies of ever larger, more complex, and more powerful levels. It is not surprising, therefore, that this tribalism and subsequent xenophobia would continue to follow us as we develop from city-states to empires and nation-states. The tribal attitude that developed into what we might call identity politics today manifested and manifests itself differently as time progresses and humans developed ever more complex societies. In the large empires of the ancient world, Middle Ages and early modern eras, this tribalism was often on display in a few distinct ways across all the eras and continents. Those who were considered part of the tribe had special benefits from those considered outsiders, and these differences were codified in those societies' laws. Pre-imperial Rome had distinct advantages and disadvantages for its citizens versus its non-citizens. The same is true for ancient Persia, the Abbasid and Ottoman empires of the Middle East, and the highly xenophobic cultures of China and Japan. Japan in particular became increasingly xenophobic after the introduction of firearms to their country in the 16th century by Europeans. According to the article Tokugawa Shogunate, quote, "In addition to controlling the daimyos, the shogunate was also concerned about the danger of foreign influence. The Tokugawa restricted trade with the most European nations, though they retained alliances with China and the Netherlands. The Tokugawa also restricted foreign literature, art, and other cultural material. In 1624, the Tokugawa made it illegal for citizens to leave the country and forbade those living abroad to return. In 1614, the Tokugawa made Buddhism the official state cult and banned alternative and foreign religions. The Tokugawa militia imprisoned and executed thousands of Japanese Christians, converted by missionaries in previous periods, and instituted a campaign to locate and destroy all foreign religious texts. The strict isolationism of Tokugawa Japan prevented the Japanese from integrating technological and social achievements into society, and eventually proved disastrous to the government." End quote. Even as the world progressed past these times, and we entered into eras where enlightened thought became popular, and the seeds of the liberal democracy movements were sown, strong examples of tribalism's hold on society persisted. The era that brought us thoughts such as all men are created equal, the foundational ideas of liberal democracy, checks and balances, natural rights of man, and more, also created and expanded the Atlantic slave trade. Indeed, the man who wrote "All men are created equal" in the United States Declaration of Independence was himself a slave owner. No greater example of societies holding onto, then somewhat perversing, their ancestral tribal instincts exists than slavery. Associating ourselves in the widest possible way, but still excluding outsiders, is an ever-evolving form of our tribal instincts. This is evidenced in ancient history as discussed before, and in modern history with the nationalism of the mid to late 19th centuries, the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, and the Cold War dynamics of the 20th century. Most recently, this tribalism based upon nationality has had a resurgence in the United States and parts of Europe. Tribalism often has racist elements, like the Atlantic slave trade. Hannah Arendt writes in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, quote, "Tribalism and racism are the very realistic, if very destructive ways of escaping this predicament of common responsibility." End quote. The common responsibility Arendt discusses is the responsibility of a society has collectively for certain decisions. In this case, the German people's responsibility for the aftermath of World War I and the Great Depression, creating a system where people not part of the tribe can be scapegoated and blamed for the problems of the nation as a whole. Tribalism in the era of nationalism, however, took on a more racist and aloof nature, as Arendt put it in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, when discussing the evolution of individual racism to group racism. Arendt states, quote, "So instead of believing in his individual superiority with some degree of essentially harmless vanity, he felt he belonged to a nation which had reached a comparatively high plane of civilization, and therefore held his position by right of birth, regardless of personal achievements." End quote. This emphasis on the tribe being better than other tribes as a whole leads to the tribe, or in our case, national citizens, rejecting immigrants or even members of their own society based on this racist view. The expulsion of former members of the tribe to the caste of outsider, or perhaps the analogy of fracturing a once unified tribe into an us and them, is more apt, is also something seen in pre-World War II Germany and other nationalist and communist nations of the 20th century. When discussing the Nazi Party in Germany and its ability to tap into the tribalism of 1930s Germany, Arendt states, quote, "Native citizens of nation-states frequently looked down upon naturalized citizens, those who had received their rights by law and not by birth, from the state and not from the nation." End quote. The idea that those who were granted citizenship by the state, rather than their nationality, created yet another system where tribalism existed within the tribe itself. or rather, where tribalism existed within the political structures of the nation-state. This same tribalism within the tribe can be seen in the relationship between the fascists and communists, or fascists and conservatives in pre-World War II Germany as well. Most of the members of those groups were part of the German tribe, as it were, yet a culture grew that fragmented them into tribes of their own, where the other side could be demonized, vilified, ignored, beaten, or even rounded up for slaughter. The Nazi leader, of course, was a tribal outsider himself, being Austrian-born and not German, but that was ignored by his own tribe. Within modern societies like the United States, where slavery has been outlawed for over a century, the tribalism of the society has become fractured into two sets. One based around race still, and another about the person's station in life, their ideological differences. Tribalism has become what today is called identity politics. Identity politics is defined in Merriam-Webster's dictionary as politics in which groups of people having a particular racial, religious, ethnic, social, or cultural identity tend to promote their own specific interests or concerns without regard to the interests or concerns of any larger political group. The development or breakdown, depending upon your view, of modern societies into groups based upon identity politics isn't a failure of modern society, rather it's natural tribal instincts manifesting themselves in a modern society. By aligning themselves, as outlined above, people are returning to a more tribal way of distinguishing themselves in society. All this isn't to say that tribalism on a larger scale ceased to exist recently. In fact, the Trump administration in the United States uses tribalism and identity politics to great effect, both uniting the national tribe against the outsider, whilst simultaneously driving deeper wedges between the tribes that make up the nation itself. And on the flip side, the Democratic Party is able to do this the same way, with the quote-unquote wedge issues that they present to the population. By focusing on the problem of immigration, illegal or legal, the administration of Donald Trump can unite certain groups of people through nationalist furor, while also breaking apart political coalitions against him with the wedge issues based upon tribal lines within the United States, separating out groups based upon race or religion, sexual orientation, beliefs on abortion or patriotism, protests, free speech, gun rights. The list goes on. The ability for cultures and societies to continue to view those not of their tribe as outsiders may seem surprising, perhaps even barbarous to modern people living in places like the West. However, there are plenty of examples of how tribalism, identity politics, and xenophobia run rampant in today's developed societies. The roots of those problems run deep into not only our history as developed human societies, but further back into our prehistory, with the foraging, hunter-gathering roots of our species. When one of the core survival mechanics of our species was unifying as a kin-based tribal group against the immense dangers of the pre-agrarian world, it is unsurprising, therefore, that particular survival instinct has followed us through the millennia and morphed into tools still used by us today, even if they are used for purposes that stand in near contrast to their origins. So before we discuss Rome or France, I have a question. When posting, and I will use a term that might make people mad, or virtue signaling posts on social media, why do you do it? I know I asked a similar question earlier, but it's something we really should think about. Why do we post and virtue signal and those types of things on the internet? Recently, there is a marked increase in posts from all across the political spectrum in the United States, signaling the poster's happiness with, expectation of, or even desire for losing followers or friends on these social media platforms based solely on people being unhappy with the political opinions they're signaling for everyone else to see. I will give an example. A few friends of mine have posted recently very simple, straightforward posts that they are conservatives, always have been, always will be, etc., and that they're voting for Trump, and if you don't like it, you can unfriend or block them. My response was something along these lines in general a couple of times, which is, I don't really care who you vote for, and certainly wouldn't unfriend you over it. My father is a lifelong Republican and conservative. He's a retired civil engineer who worked for the government his entire life. And I don't think he ever voted for a Democrat for president in his entire life. All he's ever really said about Trump was simply, I can't vote for him, so I won't. My point isn't that people shouldn't vote for Trump because my father identifies the same as them, and he didn't. My point is, people's identity isn't who they vote for or the party they belong to. And that's the main issue in the U.S. right now, which is tribalism is choking our society. I guarantee my dad doesn't sit around having a crisis of self because he doesn't want to vote for the Republican candidate when he always voted for them prior to 2016 because his identity isn't wrapped up in who he votes for. You know what helps? He isn't on Facebook. He doesn't sit around and argue all day about this or read through arguments all day about this. What makes me sad about posts like the ones that we're talking about isn't that someone is going to vote for Trump, it's that they feel like their political leanings are who they are. You just need to look at these threads to see it. Everyone is so wrapped up in being pro or anti-Trump. They have to virtue signal their politics on every single topic. Masks, COVID, Russian interference, books, media, Black Lives Matter, Thin Blue Line. The list goes on. There's so much more to people than which political tribe they want to support. And better reasons to dislike them, honestly. So what is the real root of the problem? Well, I think the real root of the problem can be found by drawing historical parallels between the tribalism of today and that of the past. The saying everything is politics or everything is political should probably be changed to everything is tribal. But when the tribalism runs too deep, that's when we start to get into trouble. So while we know with a certain amount of certainty that tribalism is something that is instinctual, perhaps even a part of our DNA, I don't know for certain what causes the tribalism to become something that's politically volatile every few centuries or decades, causing massive social and political upheaval and then dying down again. For example, why is it that the US today is so much more partisan? Indeed, even to the point of violence against one another based on political party. But that same thing wasn't true of the US in the past. Yes, there were times where our tribalism presented itself in other ways, such as the civil rights movement. But for the two sides of the issue to be strictly lined up along political lines requires us to go back to the 1850s, right before the election of Lincoln in 1860, and the Civil War. I think the reasoning is manifold, but the primary stressors that almost all conflicts, like the one the US and the other few countries find themselves in right now, is economic inequality, social inequality, a stagnant political system, and impotent, violent, fanatical leaders. Ancient Rome certainly had its share of tumultuous periods politically, and many times even devolving into civil wars between factions. But one specific time I think translates well to our conversation was the period of time just before we saw the rise of Marius and Sulla, followed by the Triumvirate. When the Punic Wars are over and the conquering of ever more territories are filling the fields with slaves and the coffers with riches, well, the fields and coffers of the rich were getting fuller, the average Roman was rapidly spiraling into economic oblivion. Imagine for a minute a society reeling from decades of warfare on foreign soil, economic collapse, partial recovery, where wealth inequality has reached staggering proportions. The wealthiest 5% own more than the other 95% combined, yet the 95% still pay crippling tax rates. Into this nightmare of riots, protests, appeasements, and uncertainty steps a leader with actual plans to help you, an average citizen. Release you from your crippling debts, high taxes, and provide you with a portion of the upper class's wealth to make a better life for yourself. That leader not only achieves the goal of ascending to power via the electorate, but then succeeds in putting those plans into motion, only for your neighbor to side with the wealthy, despite it being against all his best interests. Then imagine that leader is conspired against by the opposition party and government, and he and some of his followers are beaten to death in the streets during a speech by some of the very people he's trying to help, led by conservative members of the Senate. That might not sound far-fetched for what could happen in the United States, but no, that's a very basic version of the story of Tiberius Gracchus. These tribalistic battles in the streets of Rome eventually spilled over into full-blown civil war between the factions, culminating in Augustus becoming the first emperor of Rome and the end of the Republic. Another famous example of wealth inequality and tribalism leading to widespread violence and eventual revolution and civil war begins with high taxes, little income, and food shortages. Hey, that kind of sounds familiar from the story we just talked about from Rome. This story also evolves quickly, or devolves quickly, if you will, into political tribalism, infighting, and a suspension or destruction of the norms upon which the government and society had been built upon. In fact, in Rome, they had a name for these norms, mos maiorum. It was these norms in society and in government that kept things in check, these unwritten laws, and the destruction of those eventually led to the destruction of that republic. There are a few events I could be describing, all of which follow this pattern, of course, and I wonder, what do you think I'm describing? It's not Rome as the Republic fell. We touched on that. Could I be describing the collapse of one of the Chinese dynasties? How about the collapse of Russia in 1917? What I was talking about was the French Revolution. The French Revolution saw no shortage of violence and the tossing aside of moral and political norms, the most famous of which being the execution of King Louis XVI and his Austrian wife Marie Antoinette via the guillotine. Less famous, but still well known, were the executions of Maximilien Robespierre and his political rival Danton. Of those two, the rivalry and deaths of Danton and Robespierre might be the most obvious signs of the destruction of civility and the suspension or destruction of mos maiorum in the French Revolution. Danton and Robespierre were both revolutionaries, both radical, by any meaningful measurement of radicalism for their time. What led them to conflict was the absence of political norms and intense tribal survivalism politically, at the time in France, but especially in Paris. Without political norms and institutions in place to guide the behavior of the members of the French government, the sides were allowed to, for all intents and purposes, eat each other alive. The government of France had undergone monumental changes, repeatedly, over the course of a few years' time, and the shockwaves of those tremors were still being felt throughout French society and government. The upheaval resulted in mass executions, riots, and government repression, due in no small part to the lack of institutional control and norms. So what's the context here? Why are we jumping around discussing tribalism, mos maiorum, and civil discourse? Well, take a look around you if you live in the United States, or if you don't live in the U.S., chances are you're already understanding exactly what we're talking about. This is a cautionary tale, one many people have been trying to tell since the nomination of Donald Trump as the GOP candidate to the presidency in 2016. In June of 2020, Foreign Affairs published an article by Darren Acemoglu, a professor of economics from MIT, titled, quote, "America's Democratic Unraveling. Countries fail the same way businesses do, gradually and then suddenly," end quote. In the article, Professor Acemoglu lays out plainly the unraveling of U.S. institutions and political norms during the Trump presidency. Focusing at first on 2020, starting with the inability of the legislature to check Trump after the $400 million military aid holdup with the Ukraine over an investigation into his political opponent was laid out for the world to see in Congress. Quote, "Even more shocking to those who still had faith in the U.S. Constitution to restrain Trump was the unwillingness of the Republican-dominated Senate to so much as hear all of the evidence against the president. Then came Trump's audacious firing of Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, Director of European Affairs with the National Security Council, both of whom testified during the impeachment inquiry. Even Vindman's twin brother did not escape dismissal from his job at the NSC. The Intelligence Community Inspector General, Michael Atkinson, was next to be fired, one of 5 inspectors general to be dismissed in the last 3 months," end quote. Remember, that was written in June of 2020. The unraveling of the norms has continued, even increased since that time. More importantly, and definitely more adverse to the nation as a whole, was the refusal of the White House to properly prepare the nation for COVID-19, particularly the efforts which he had missed doing to mislead the country by the president. Next was the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and the backlash from that. The anger over the treatment of minorities in the U.S. by the government continues to grow, and in its face, the current administration has taken unprecedented steps to stoke the flames and spread misinformation and hate of their political enemies by their own supporters. Recently, the Department of Justice went so far as to declare certain cities anarchist jurisdictions, which supporters of the president defend via claims that those cities are burning to the ground. Claims which are based on the reality of some protests turning to riots, but are demonstrably false due to their hyperbolic nature, and those claims being seeded by falsehoods. All of this is the result of the dismantling of the institutions and norms that had previously been the foundation of American society and government. Democratic and Republican institutions are put in place to restrain leaders by creating a balance, delicate as it may be, between the different branches of government and the political action and the will of the people. These are all based, though, on norms, on mos maiorum. Norms like compromise and respect for facts and expertise, trust in an active and informed population and a free press. These norms have been under attack for decades in the United States. What the current administration takes advantage of and tears asunder has been eroded for close to 40 years. The point we are at now is the sudden collapse phase. The neutralization of the free press and confidence of the citizenry once held the institutions up, but their erosion has allowed for the transgressions of government to now go unchecked, unpunished, and shockingly, it's become normalized. Hugo Chavez, Vladimir Putin, and a Drogan are all examples from the first half of the 21st century that clearly demonstrate the slow erosion of norms, giving way to the collapse of democratic institutions, making way for autocratic regimes. Through threats, demonization of the opposing tribe, deployment of the authorities against the population, neutralization of the judicial branches, and stacking the government with corrupt friends and family. Those three used the tried and true playbook for taking absolute power for themselves. A playbook to a game that's rapidly reaching its conclusion. When the two tribes in a society start showing up at each other's protests with the intent to do physical harm to each other, you've reached a critical stage. And you could see this in the history leading up to the Civil War in the United States. In the 1850s, with Bleeding Kansas and John Brown and his violent revolutions against those who were slave owners. While the course correction is not impossible at this stage in the game here in the US, it will be both painful and more than likely violent. Just looking to history, you can find many examples of both the erosion of norms leading to collapse of a society and the erosion of norms leading to the rebuilding of those norms and the revival of a social and political order. While tribalism, bipartisanship, and lack of civility online may be issues, they're just symptoms of the larger problem. Indeed, they could simply be described as tools used in the purposeful creation of the problem. The destruction, not the erosion, that time has passed, of political and social norms is the heart of the issue. When one set of bad actors is allowed to get away with poor behavior, then another, and then the next, the dam breaks. You have the tribes go from yelling at each other online, or in the case of the past, the public forums and cafes, to literally showing up armed to kill one another in the streets, while the leaders of one tribe or the other seek to grab power in the turmoil. It's a pattern in history. It's easily read if you know how to read it. It's hard to argue with the pattern we see now. It is demonstrably mirroring that of the past. It's patently obvious to all but the willfully ignorant. Ignore history at your own risk indeed.